4. Twin Max Electrosphere! 2 electrospheres, double their normal size, appeared in the palms of Narberal's outstretched hands. She fired them simultaneously. Impact! The electrospheres, with increased destructive power, swelled to scatter their electric shocks over a huge area. The graveyard was illuminated with a dazzling white light. The magic shocks disappeared a moment later, but their destruction was absolute. Khajiit's underlings were all sprawled on the ground. In their midst stood a single shadow. Ah, if only you were as easy to squash as the caterpillar you are. Did you cast electric energy immunity or something? As soon as she asked, she noticed a scorch mark on his cheek. That meant it must have been something weaker than electric energy immunity, maybe electric energy protection. Narberal was a little disappointed she hadn't wiped them all out in one shot, but comforted herself by deciding the offense was forgivable. Besides, ending it all at once would be no fun.
So you're not just an idiot. You're an idiot who can use Tier 3 magic.
An idiot? A human mite like you dares to call me an idiot?
Her eyebrows twitched.
What's wrong with me calling the fool interfering with my plan an idiot? But you're going to be dead before you can even recognize my strength for what it is. My preparations are already complete. I've gathered enough negative energy. Behold the power of this supreme jewel.
Khajiit held up the stone in his hand. It was a plain jewel with a gleam like black iron, neither polished nor cut. Raw ore were probably the words that came closest to describing it. Narberal thought she saw it pulse. Suddenly, 6 of the leading disciples, who should have been burned to a crisp, sluggishly stood up. These motions were not willed by life, but ruled by death. They moved on unsteady feet to stand between Narberal and Khajiit. Narberal looked on quizzically.
You're making me fight zombies?
That's exactly what I'm doing. That will do. Attack!
Zombies were the lowest tier of undead, and had no magic ability. The former leading disciples came clawing at her, but she cast a spell.
Electrosphere!
Another sphere of white light scattered shocks throughout the area, swallowing up all of the leading disciples. When the electric flash died down, the disciples collapsed to the ground once again. Although she had mopped them all up with ease, Narberal's face was sober. Great Undead didn't have the power to turn multiple corpses into undead at once.
Did he use some kind of supporting skill?
Her eyes flicked to the black lump in his hand. It was probably that item that allowed him to create and control multiple zombies at once. Wasn't that language a bit presumptuous for such a wimpy effect? The 41 supreme beings who ruled the Great Tomb of Nazarick and created Narberal and the other NPCs were the ones worthy of the word supreme. Those were the unpleasant things on Narberal's mind when Khajiit shouted with joy.
That's plenty! I've absorbed enough negative energy.
The black lump in Khajiit's hand looked like it was absorbing the darkness of the graveyard and giving off a faint glow, and it was pulsing more obviously than before, beating quietly like a heart.
There'll be trouble if I let him do much more,
Narberal decided. Just as she was about to make her move, she heard something slicing through the air. Remembering her master's words, she jumped clear. Something enormous buzzed the spot where she'd been standing before pulling up to hover in front of Khajiit and landing slowly. It was an agglomeration of human bones around 10 feet tall, made up of countless pieces. The form it took on had a long neck, 4 legs, and wings. A dragon. Its tail, composed of innumerable bones, gave the ground a heavy whack. It was a monster called a skeletal dragon. Level-wise, it wasn't so strong compared to Narberal, but it did have one trait that was potentially fatal for Nabe. For the first time in this fight, her face registered surprise and annoyance. Khajiit's unhinged laugh echoed throughout the area.
Skeletal dragons have absolute resistance to magic. Casters are helpless against them.
Nabe's magic wouldn't be able to do anything against the skeletal dragon. In that case, she took out the sword her master had instructed her to carry, still in its sheath. The sword was bound to the sheath with a cord, so it wouldn't come out so easily.
I'll clobber it to death.
She charged. The dragon tried to counter by stomping with its front legs, but she slipped neatly past them. Her hair weaving in the gust of air created by the attack, she dove for its chest. She took a focused swing, using every muscle in her body. The skeletal dragon may have been 10 feet tall, but it went flying. A moment later, the vibrations of its impact reached them with a giant thud.
What?
Khajiit was astounded. Skeletal dragons were lighter than they looked, since they were made of bone. That's still lighter, though. Knocking it back was not the type of feat a caster who had spent their days in pursuit of arcane-type magic should be able to perform. Hastily moving behind the skeletal dragon for cover, Khajiit screamed,
Who are you? A mithril? No, or Calcum adventurer? I didn't think there were any in this city. Are you after Clementine?
He gnashed his teeth so hard it seemed like they would break. Narberal sighed.
It's 'cause you get all worked up like that you're a click beetle.
Why, you...
He'd used up a huge amount of negative energy and spent 2 months performing a huge ritual to create this skeletal dragon. Was it going to be defeated this easily? In the final stretch of his multiple-year plan? As Khajiit's face grew blotchy with rage, the skeletal dragon slowly creaked and squeaked its way to its feet. There were large cracks in the bones making up its chest, and broken pieces were crumbling out. He couldn't let her hit it again.
No, you can't! I won't let you! Ray of negative energy!
A black beam shot out of Khajiit's hand and hit the skeletal dragon, rapidly healing the wounds with negative energy.
So you were talking so big about its absolute resistance to magic, but you can still use magic to heal it, huh?
Khajiit ignored her quip and cast a series of spells.
Reinforce armor, lesser strength, undead flames, shield wall!
All of them were buffs for the skeletal dragon. Its bones grew harder, its strength was magically increased, and its body was enveloped in black flames that would drain life energy. Then an invisible wall formed to cover one side of its body like a shield.
2 can play at that game. Reinforce armor, shield wall, negative energy protection.
Narberal cast a handful of defensive spells. Once they had both protected themselves well enough, they returned to fighting, as if the bell for round 2 had rung. Narberal brandished her sword. While beating on the skeletal dragon's front legs, she furrowed her brow. Things had gone well before, but she couldn't call the present situation good. She wasn't built for physical clashes, and her weapon was lousy. Since the dragon was made of bones, stabbing and cutting weapons didn't do much damage. A battering weapon would have been the most effective, but Narberal didn't have one. That was why she was using her sheath. But although she was on the offensive, she wasn't balanced well when she swung, so it didn't seem like she was dealing damage very effectively. An actual warrior might be able to keep their balance, but Narberal was a caster. She wasn't performing very well in that department. The skeletal dragon swung a front leg and missed as Narberal ducked. Part of her caught the dragon's black flames, but negative energy protection blocked them and they disappeared immediately. If she hadn't defended herself, she would have probably taken damage despite dodging the attack.
Ray of negative energy!
Khajiit sent a beam to heal the dragon's wounds. This was another cause of Narberal's brow furrowing. Even if she managed to hurt the monster, Khajiit would just heal it from his position in the rear. Why didn't she attack Khajiit first? She couldn't because of the skeletal dragon he'd stuck right between them. Even if she used a piercing spell like lightning, the dragon's absolute magic resistance would block it. An area of effect spell like Electrosphere would have almost no effect because of the defensive spells Khajiit had cast. Then how about mind control? Barring resistance, it could let her win in one shot.
Charm person! Undead mind!
Narberal and Khajiit both cast at the same time. Narberal, a spell that could charm humans on Khajiit. Khajiit, a defensive spell that would block psychic magic on himself. The result? Khajiit flashed a triumphant smile, and Narberal frowned and practically clicked her tongue in disgust. Was she too distracted by Khajiit's smile? A shadow fell over her face. Her entire field of vision was taken up by a white mass. Evasion seems difficult. Her mind was immediately racing. She brought the point of her sheathed sword to her opposite shoulder and held the whole thing across her body like a shield. The impact sent numbing vibrations through the sword to her hands, shoulders, and whole body, which went soaring into the air. A tail attack aimed right at her face had sent her flying.
Okay.
Balance intact, Narberal nimbly landed on her feet and retreated farther away. It would have been the perfect time for the skeletal dragon to follow up its attack, but it didn't. It had to protect Khajiit, so it couldn't stray too far. Keeping an eye on the dragon, Narberal tried to shake the numbness and pain out of her trembling hands. Then Khajiit peeked out from behind the monster.
Acid javelin! Lightning!
His green spear went flying straight at Narberal. Normally she would have been wounded by the spray of acid, but it was repelled a couple inches away from her body and disappeared. At the same time, the bolt of lightning that sprang from Narberal's finger was nullified when the skeletal dragon moved to block it. The two adversaries glared at each other.
You cast a defensive spell? What a pain.
A pain? That's my line, bagworm moth. Why don't you quit hiding and come out here?
Why should I do that?
Won't your plan go haywire if you're tied up fighting?
She was right. Khajiit narrowed his glare while Narberal just smiled.
I see I have no choice.
Having made up his mind, Khajiit squeezed the strange sphere once again. Then he held it up high.
Behold the power of the Jewel of Death!
Narberal lost her balance, proof that the ground was shaking. It was a sign that something big had arrived. A moment later, the ground cracked open and something white slowly climbed out.
Another one?
I'm already out of negative energy. But if I kill you and your friend, and then spread death throughout town, I should be able to get quite a bit back.
Narberal was unfazed, but Khajiit was yelling furiously. She exhaled sharply and broke into a run faster than any normal person could run. Khajiit was caught off guard and didn't have time to react. As Narberal entered the skeletal dragon's range, it tried to attack her with its front legs. She twisted her body to slip past the stomps on her right, but then the other dragon's tail came to sweep her feet out from under her. She jumped clear, and not a second too soon. Right below her, the tail plowed noisily through the spot she'd been standing. Then it changed directions, and whipped into the air to swing down at her. The tail strike shook the ground, but Narberal had managed to dodge to the left, except the dragon on the right closed in to hit her with a front leg.
Gah!
She took the forceful hit with her sword. It was not very light, but she stopped the foot and then shoved it back. The attacking skeletal dragon retreated, creating another brief interlude in the fighting.
What are you, to be able to block those attacks without using a martial art? How did you get so strong?
I was created by supreme beings whose powers surpass even the gods.
I won't buy that, you idiot.
You can't recognize the truth when you hear it, and call me an idiot? This is why humans are nothing more than planarians.
Narberal flashed her eyes at Khajiit. It was such a strong gaze that it gave him the chills, and he took a step back. As if to shake himself free of his fear, he gave an order.
Get her, skeletal dragons!
The dragons, maintaining proximity to Khajiit, attacked Narberal again. She dodged one blow and tried to move in, but lost her chance while evading a second. In the midst of that back and forth, Khajiit made a decisive strike.
Acid Javelin!
The magic spear flew straight at her face, and Narberal moved her head, without thinking, to dodge it. That was a mistake. It wouldn't have done anything if it had hit her, so she should have ignored it. But since it was aimed at her face, her instincts had taken over. This was an error only a caster who hadn't concentrated their efforts on melee combat would make, and she paid for it. With a screeching noise, Narberal's view abruptly changed. Everything flew by sideways. After a moment of weightlessness, she crashed into the ground. She'd taken a swipe of a skeletal dragon's tail to her left upper arm, but still tumbling over and over, she couldn't tell what had happened. The multiple defensive spells she had cast meant there wasn't much pain. She was flat on the ground, but before her eyes were two skeletal dragons. Both of them were brandishing their front legs. It seemed like the end of the line. Normally it would be.
If you surrender, I'll spare you.
Khajiit, sure of his victory, grinned sadistically. Surely he had no intention of sparing her. That grin spoke louder than his words. He would simply savor the look on her face as he crushed her after she'd pleaded for her life. Narberal sat up, and her face was twisted in anger.
Come.
What? She glared at him.
Human scum! Don't talk that shit to me, you piece of garbage!
Eyes bulging, Khajiit shivered and screamed a panicky order.
Crush her, skeletal dragons!
As the feet began to move, Narberal smiled. She couldn't miss the voice of the one she worshipped, no matter how far away it was coming from.
Narberal Gamma, show them the might of Nazarick.
As my lord wishes. Then I shall face them not as Nabe, but as Narberal Gamma.
She was still on the ground, and the dragon legs seemed like they were about to crush her. One blink of an eye, and she'd be stomped flat. Then she cast a spell.
Teleportation!
Her view changed instantaneously, to one from more than 1,600 feet in the air. Naturally, having no wings, she plummeted toward the ground. The wind roared past her, and the ground grew closer. She cackled.
Fly!
Gradually slowing, she eventually came to a stop, hovering in the air. Looking down, she saw the battlefield she had just been on, Khajiit and the two skeletal dragons. They glanced around restlessly, no doubt bewildered by her sudden disappearance.
I'm tired.
Clementine commented loud enough that Ainz could hear. After several minutes of action, Ainz's greatswords hadn't so much as grazed her.
But, you do seem pretty strong. You're probably proud of that, but...
Her smile turned carnivorous.
Are you some kind of dummy? You're just swinging that thing around with brute strength. There's no technique. You're like a kid swinging a stick around. I mean, it doesn't do you any good to have a sword in each hand if you can't use them right. It'd be smarter to use just one. I don't know if you appreciate the complexities of being a warrior.
Then maybe you should attack me. All you've been doing this whole time is evading. You're the one who's deeper in trouble the more time goes by, right?
Ainz sneered. Clementine scowled. It was true that she hadn't attacked him even once. She'd just been dodging. Faced with his superior physical abilities, she hadn't been able to find an opening. In other words, she hadn't been having such an easy time either. Her irritation at herself stemmed from her earlier bragging.
I thought there weren't any warriors who could beat you. Where'd that confidence go?
Finally, allowing Ainz to provoke her, she drew a weapon. From the 4 stilettos and a morning star she had hanging from her waist, she had selected a stiletto. Noting with his extraordinary vision that the morning star was caked with what looked like meaty blood, Ainz clenched both his great swords with his full strength. Just as both of them were about to step forward, the ground shook. In combat mode, Clementine couldn't shift her gaze too much, but she did take a look to see what was going on. There were 2 dragons made out of bones over where Narberal was fighting. Skeletal dragons?
Bingo! That's right. You know your stuff, huh? They're a caster's worst nightmare.
I see. So that's why you say Nabe can't win.
Exactly. Having regained composure with the appearance of the skeletal dragons, Clementine returned to her previous mocking tone.
The illusion face under Ainz's helmet grimaced. Skeletal dragons were a tough opponent for casters, and against 2 of them, Narberal, the way she was now, had as good as no chance at winning. Perhaps sensing his frustration, Clementine made a subtle move. It could have been a feint, but it wouldn't be only a feint. If a warrior showed a talented adversary a weak spot, they could bet that advantage would be taken. Pushing Narberal to the edge of his consciousness, Ainz thrust his left hand's great sword out like a spear as a threat and held the one in his right hand over his head. Clementine's weapon was a stabbing weapon. It didn't have the variety of attacks a cutting weapon did. Stab, that was all it could do. And her stilettos were delicate, not sturdy enough to clash with a greatsword. So, with his left sword up, making it difficult for her to approach, he just waited for her. But she realized what he was up to. Do you have a way to close that distance?
Oh, I don't know.
Her casual attitude, relaxed appearance, and flippant smile told him she wasn't lacking ideas. Slowly, her posture changed. It was as if she were crouched and on her mark, but standing up. An odd posture. In a way, it was kind of a funny pose, but it definitely wasn't a stance that could be taken lightly. Then she moved. To Ainz's alert eyes, she was like a spring that had been compressed to its limits and sprung. She was racing directly at him at a speed that was hard for Ainz to believe. It seemed beyond what flesh was capable of. Like a storm moving in to swallow everything up in a moment, Clementine closed the distance in the blink of an eye and slipped past the pointed greatsword without losing speed. Her movements were like a snake going in for the kill. Startled, Ainz swung his right arm with his immense strength. The mighty attack seemed to cut the very air and was accompanied by unimaginable destructive power. He had less than a split second, but noted the fisher-like smile on her face intensify.
Impenetrable fortress!
Beholding something that should be impossible, Ainz shivered in astonishment. The slim stiletto had taken the full force of the blow from his great sword, more than 10 times its weight. The sword, taking Ainz's glorious attack, should have snapped in half. Or even if by some miracle it didn't, Clementine should have gone flying. On the contrary, Ainz's sword bounced back, as if he'd hit a tremendously solid castle wall. Clementine jumped at his wide-open chest like a lover slipping into an embrace. Her well-formed features and the smile widened across them loomed large in his field of vision. The attack came well before he could retreat. Uniting her full-throttle sprint with the strength of all her muscles, she took advantage of her body's momentum to deliver a strike that deserved the word meteor. The sparkle of a flourish and the awful cree of scraping metal echoed loudly through the graveyard. Ainz hastily swung his left greatsword, but Clementine jumped aside. He knew her trick. A martial art. They were moves to be careful of. Skills that didn't exist in Yggdrasil. Warrior magic. It must protect her sword and give her physical indomitability. That had to be how she'd repelled Ainz's attack.
Tough stuff! What's that armor made of? Adamantite?
There wasn't any pain at all, but at the time of that abrasive noise he'd felt something with a sharp point stick into the area near his left shoulder. Shocked, he looked at his shoulder and discovered a slight dent. It may not have had any special magical powers, But this was still armor made by a level 100 caster, and it was proportionally hard. The fact that Clementine had managed to damage it spoke volumes to her destructive power.
Well, whatever. Just next time I gotta hit somewhere less heavily protected. Oh, but I wanted to chip away at you till you couldn't move and torture you. Too bad. What a shame.
Hearing that she attacked his shoulder not by chance, but because she was aiming to incapacitate his arm, caused Ainz to respect her. A bit. For the first time. Ainz always ended up swinging with causing damage in mind. That was sufficient enough when one sound hit would kill his opponent, but against a tougher one he had to think about how the battle would play out. A good lesson to learn.
Okay, here I go.
While he'd been admiring her, Clementine had once again taken the odd bent-over posture from before. In response, Ainz raised the greatsword in his right hand, but this time he didn't thrust out the left sword. Seeing that, Clementine smiled and rushed forward. She was moving so fast even Ainz's dynamic visual acuity couldn't make her out. If she hadn't been coming in a straight line, he might have lost sight of her. She flew at him like a sinister arrow, and in response he carried out his planned attack. The greatsword in his right hand swung and,
Impenetrable fortress!
Bounced back against the same martial art from before. But he'd expected that. The previous time he had swung as hard as he could, so the rebound had broken his stance. This time he didn't use as much force. The shock felt like hitting a hard wall, but he overcame it with the strength of his arm, and then swung his left greatsword. He was confident she couldn't withstand 2 of his transcendent full-power blows. But before he could connect, she used a different martial art.
Flow acceleration!
It made something mind-boggling happen. It was almost as if she had manipulated time. In this sluggish space, where everything moved as if it had fallen into a highly viscous fluid, Ainz's greatsword moved at a snail's pace. Only Clementine maintained her speed in this quiet world. She easily evaded his counterattack and slipped right in front of him. Perhaps it was in Ainz's head. He was wearing rings against time manipulation that hindered movement to prevent external forces from slowing him down. Not that this couldn't be something new. It must have just been her sudden acceleration causing him to perceive things that way, in his heightened battle mode. After all, he'd seen this martial art before, and it hadn't affected him like this. It was a martial art Gazef Stronov had used. But before he could get the shout out, the stiletto stabbed at him. She'd aimed for the narrow slit in his helmet, his eyes. Ainz shook his head away and avoided getting it stuck in the slit, but the sound of metal grating on his helmet was horrible. Before he could feel any relief at having dodged, he caught Clementine in the corner of his vision, holding her stiletto back, as if she were coiled and ready to spring. Tch! Even taking into account their difference in strength, Clementine's direct line of attack was faster than the arc of Ainz's sword. This time she didn't miss, and her sword stabbed into the slit of his helmet.
Huh?
Gah! The puzzled question and the flustered grunt occurred at the same time. Pressing his helmet with the hand that held his sword, Ainz retreated quite a ways without countering. Watching him from the corner of her eye as she looked curiously at the tip of her stiletto, she joked,
Better stop talking about handicaps. If you don't start fighting for real, you're gonna die.
Ainz didn't say anything, so she asked a question to clear up her doubt.
But how did you not take any damage from that attack before? I thought for sure it'd be a pain parade.
Sheesh. I've learned a lot during this fight. First, about a new martial art, and then about how important it is to use your whole body for balance and not just swinging your weapon around.
Huh? Are you stupid? You figured this out now? Some warrior you are. Well, you're gonna die now anyway, so it doesn't matter. But I did want you to answer my question. Was it a defensive martial art?
Sensing her annoyance, Ainz smiled wryly under his helmet. About his qualifications as a warrior, she was right.
I really came underprepared. I apologize, but we're running out of time. Let's stop playing games.
Ignoring the confusion on Clementine's face, he raised his voice.
Narberal Gamma, show them the might of Nazarick.
Ein spun the hilts of his swords till their blades pointed down and thrust them into the ground. Putting his empty hands out in front of him, he beckoned her gently.
Now come at me, like you're ready to die.
So it wasn't a bluff, eh? You can actually use fly. But how did you dodge that attack? I couldn't see because I was behind the dragon.
The voice directed at Narberal as she slowly descended back to Earth was cautious. He couldn't fathom why she hadn't used fly to run away, especially having encountered 2 skeletal dragons. Who wouldn't pull out if they could?
You think you have a chance at winning against skeletal dragons with absolute magic resistance?
There are any number of ways for me to win. But first... Narberal grabbed the shoulder of her robe and tore it away. Rejoice, human scum, for you have received the honor of facing Narberal Gamma of the Pleiades, combat maids, loyal to the absolute ruler of the great tomb of Nazarick, supreme being Lord Ainzul Gone. All of her gear had transformed. She wore vambraces and greaves of silver, gold, and black metal, armor like a maid outfit from a manga, and instead of a helmet, a white lace headpiece. In her hands she gripped a staff of silver-coated gold. The performance of custom items in Yggdrasil could be changed by changing their data crystal makeup. Nabe's robe had the quick change crystal, so she could change her whole gear set without spending any time swapping pieces. The robe was put away into space. Khajiit blinked several times at the maid who'd just appeared before his eyes. Then he finally grasped the situation.
What?
And shouted in disbelief. Sure, it was perfectly normal for the caster in front of him to turn into a maid. Her outfit was a joke and made him uncomfortable, but the exceedingly calm look on her face made him panic, and he ordered the skeletal dragons to attack. The 2 dragons approached Narberal with surprising agility. One of the huge bony monsters went to crush her with a foreleg, but when it was a hair's breadth away from whacking her, she cast a spell. Dimensional move.
Not again.
Narberal vanished once more. Trying to see where she went, Khajiit remembered last time and looked up into the sky, but this time he would learn where she'd gone via pain.
No!
His shriek echoed across the graveyard. A white-hot sensation suddenly shot through his left shoulder, and a dull pain radiated through his body with each beat of his heart. Stupefied, he looked at the spot and saw a sharp point jutting out. The next second, the blade was ripped carelessly out, creating a new wave of acute pain.
God!
The vibrations of his bone being sawed propagated through his body, combining with the pain to increase his discomfort. Blood glubbed out of the puncture, soaking his black robe. In so much agony he was drooling. He spun around to see what had happened. Narberal was standing there with a puzzled look on her face. Does it hurt that much? She was toying with a freshly bloodied, black-bladed dagger in the hand that didn't hold her staff. Khajiit was in so much agony he couldn't even speak. Because he was a caster, he was never out on the front lines, and he was waited on by so many people that although he had occasion to give pain, he was rarely on the receiving end. As a result, he had low tolerance. As clammy sweat coated his forehead, inside his head he gave orders to the skeletal dragons. Narberal leaped away. Fly was faster than running. The dragons inserted themselves into the open space. Behind them, Khajiit, who, having secured a safe location, had regained a shred of composure, finally understood the significance of Narberal's previous spell. It was
teleportation magic?
Dimensional Move was a Tier 3 spell, but it was generally thought of as an escape spell, used to quickly put distance between the caster and their opponent. But that was in the case of a physically inferior caster. If one had strength that could put a warrior to shame, the spell could be just as valuable as an attack spell. No, since it was unblockable, it was actually better than lesser attack spells. Holding his shoulder, he scowled at Narberal.
I see. So your ace move is teleporting in for the kill. And that's also how you evaded that attack earlier.
It was certainly a pesky ace. If magic didn't work on the skeletal dragons, she could kill the summoner. An obvious strategy. And if she made effective use of teleportation magic, there was a good chance he wouldn't be able to stop her. But Narberal scoffed lightly in reply. I don't think so. Khajiit's eyelids fluttered for a moment as he failed to comprehend what she was saying. Then, to clarify, she began to move.
I just demonstrated one way I could easily kill you.
Narberal had been at an overwhelming disadvantage, but the moment she seemed to reveal the way she would turn the tables, she renounced it instead. Khajiit had no idea why she would do that.
Are you insane?
I get that you're a flea, but what kind of reply is that? It'd be nice if you'd use your head a little more.
Her frigid glare made his whole body tremble, not from anger, but from fear. Anxiety flickered through his mind.
Let's end this soon. It's rude of me as a follower of Lord Ainz to keep him waiting. You seem to think magic won't work on skeletal dragons, so allow me to create a learning opportunity for you, pawn skater. The lesson fee is your life.
She dropped her staff, and the sound of her hands clapping together rang out. When she pulled them apart, white shocks arced between them. Reacting to the lightning writhing like Chinese dragons, the nearby air sparkled as it discharged. It was like she was enveloped in a white light.
Gah!
Khajiit's eyes nearly popped out of his head. He had no more words. He knew she was casting a spell far beyond anything he was aware of. Within the white light frying his eyes, he could see her faint smile, recalling the huge skeletal dragons standing between them. The clamorous alarm bells in his head made him scream.
You can't defeat skeletal dragons with magic! They have absolute resistance! Go! Kill her!
He ordered in a trembling voice that betrayed the fear he couldn't hide. As the dragons approached, Narberal smiled like a cruel instructor who was about to educate a foolish pupil.
Absolute resistance? They do have resistance, but the power they have is to nullify spells from Tier 6 and below.
It took a little more time for the dragons to reach Narberal, during which Khajiit realized, with an awfully level head, what she meant by that.
In other words, I, Narberal Gamma, can use more powerful magic than that, so they won't be able to nullify my attack.
She wasn't lying. Khajiit's gut told him that. Which meant that this woman's magic could slay the dragons, and then kill him too.
Why? You're going to destroy the fruit of more than 5 years of labor in less than an hour?
Khajiit squawked. Scenes of his past flickered before his eyes like the shadows of a revolving lantern. Khajiit Dale Barantel, given life as the only child of a father with a robust physique forged by village labor and a gentle mother in a remote slain theocracy village, he had a normal childhood. He started down the path from then to his current self when he found the remains of his mother. That day, the sun had been low on the horizon. Khajiit had been racing toward his house. His mother had told him to be home early, but he was late for some reason he couldn't even remember anymore. He'd been on the outskirts of the village looking for cool rocks. He'd picked up a stick and pretended to be a hero, something stupid like that. Thinking his mother would scold him, he'd flown into the house and seen her sprawled on the floor. Shocked, he'd panicked, and even now he could remember the warmth he'd felt when he'd touched her. You've got to be kidding me. His expectations had been betrayed. His mother was dead. The clergyman said the cause of death was a lump of blood that formed in her brain. In other words, it was no one's fault. No one was in the wrong. No, Khajiit felt there was one and only person to blame. Himself. If he had gotten home sooner that day, would he have been able to save her? There was a huge number of slain Theocracy's faith magic casters, including several in his village. If he had gone to them for help, would his mother still be alive and smiling? The face of his precious mother, twisted in pain, was a crime he had perpetuated. Khajiit made up his mind. He would live to right his wrong, i.e., bring his mother back to life. The more magic and knowledge he acquired, the bigger the obstacles he faced. There was a resurrection spell on Faith Magic's 5th tier, but he couldn't bring his mother back with it. During the resurrection, the deceased consumed a vast amount of life force. If the body didn't have enough, it would be impossible to resurrect and turn to ashes. His mother didn't have the life force in her for that. But he didn't have enough time to develop a new resurrection spell, so he would give up being human and turn undead to buy the time. That was the conclusion he came to. He abandoned the faith magic path he'd been walking and turned down the path of using arcane magic and becoming an undead, but he was confronted with another wall. It would take an extremely long time to plow ahead as an arcane magic caster, quit being human, and become a powerful undead. Then there was also the hurdle of talent and ability. It was possible he wouldn't be able to become an undead. The breakthrough he conceived was to gather a vast amount of negative energy. Yes, the amount that killing every person living in a city and turning them into an undead would generate. Why, at the moment his desire would be realized, was there someone getting in his way?
Why should you have the right to make my 5 years of preparation in this city? The feelings I can't forget even though it's been more than 30 years, all for nothing? You just came out of nowhere!
The response to Khajiit's howl was a sardonic smile.
I'm not interested in your feelings, but I do have something to say to you for all your laughable hard work. You made a lovely stepping stone for Lord Ainz. Twin Max Chain Dragon Lightning!
Lightning writhing like a dragon shot out from each of Narberal's hands. The skeletal dragon's giant white frames trembled when the lightning bolts, each thicker than a human's arm, met them. The lightning that coiled like Chinese dragons around the skeletal dragon's bodies burned up that false life that made the dead bones move. The result was immediate. The skeletal dragons, who were supposed to have absolute resistance to magic, were turned to rubble by magic lightning. Even after they had completely crumbled, the lightning didn't disappear. The 2 electric dragons raised their heads as if searching for their next prey and raced through the sky to their last remaining target. Khajiit's entire field of vision filled with pure white electric light. There was no time to beg for mercy, no time to scream. The tears that welled up in the corners of his eyes vaporized in an instant, leaving nothing behind but a whisper. "Mother." Khajiit was devoured by the lightning. His muscles went into convulsions and his body writhed where he'd stood, as if he were doing a strange dance. After rapidly burning through his insides, the electricity vanished, and Khajiit fell to the ground, smoking from his burns. The stench of cooking flesh wafted throughout the area. Narberal shrugged and called out to Khajiit, whose body had curled up into a ball as his muscles burned up.
Even worms smell good grilled. Might make a nice souvenir for Entima.
Dropping the name of her fellow Pleiades member who preyed on humans, Narberal sneered. The warrior before her opened up his arms as if he were going to hug her.
What are you doing? You give up?
No. What? I just figured that since I gave Narberal the order, I should probably settle this pretty soon as well.
Huh? Are you serious? How can you win against me with no martial arts or any decent skills? How much more annoying can you be?
You talk a lot of crap for a wimp.
You're the wimp!
She nearly raged, but instead calmed her seething heart. The man before her had little skill as a warrior, but his physical ability easily exceeded the realm of ordinary humans. As far as she knew, it was surpassed only by two demigods, the Black Scripture's extra seat and its captain, who occupied the first seat. But because of that, he swung his sword around however he felt like, which made both his offense and defense sloppy, which meant he was in danger of being dealt a fatal blow. Clementine put on her usual sneer and taunted him.
Well, I do agree we should settle this.
Momon the warrior merely shrugged in reply. She coolly observed the way he carried himself. He was full of holes, but that couldn't be true. It had to be a trap. But she didn't have a choice. What she'd said a moment ago had sounded like a joke, but she'd meant it. She figured she could escape, if she could borrow a skeletal dragon, but she couldn't afford to lose any more time. Even if it was to throw off the flurry scripture members who had come to the city, playtime was going a little long. She slowly moved into a crouch and tightened her grip on her stiletto. She wanted this critical clash to be short, if possible, over in one hit. She didn't have time, but the other thing was that the warrior seemed to be gradually getting the hang of things. It was safer to crush him before he grew into a monster she couldn't handle. With a sharp exhalation, Clementine charged.
Stride of wind! Greater evasion! Ability boost! Greater ability boost!
She used the same 4 martial arts from before all at once to get her physical ability even a little closer to his. Regardless of how Momon had fought so far, there was still the possibility he could use martial arts. In her accelerating world, she could see her opponent's every move. He was going to take his swords out of the ground and attack, or use a martial art, or hand-to-hand combat, or a hidden weapon. No, a throwing weapon. She could think of a zillion ways he could attack her, but she was confident she could prevail over any of them. Then he betrayed her expectations.
He's not doing anything?
The Dark Warrior just stood there, arms open, as if he was welcoming her attack. A chill ran up Clementine's spine. Fear of the unknown. He was acting completely outside the scenarios she'd imagined.
Should I keep charging or retreat?
Those were her only 2 options. Clementine was cold-blooded and cruel, but she wasn't stupid. In the split second left, she calculated out countless possibilities and countermeasures. What gave her the push to continue was self-confidence and pride in her abilities. Even though she'd betrayed them, she was a member of the Slain Theocracy's strongest special ops unit, the Black Scripture, and she could count the number of warriors powerful enough to defeat her on her fingers. There was no way she could run from this Momon character who had no reputation and little skill. Once she'd made her decision, the rest happened quickly. Her hesitation vanished, and having regained the cool composure befitting a top-class warrior, she leaped in close to Momon's chest.
Die!
The stiletto she thrust, mobilizing all her body's muscles, stabbed into the slit in his close helmet. Then she twisted it. She increased pressure to reach the back of his skull, and then wiggled the blade to break the nearby blood vessels so the wound would be fatal beyond a doubt. An armored arm wrapped tightly around her body, but she paid it no mind and followed up with another attack. Responding to her desire to kill him dead, the magic power contained in her stiletto was unleashed. Lightning. Electricity coursed through Ainz's entire body. Clementine's weapon was invested with the power of magic accumulation. The magic was drained in one shot, but it was possible to load up all different spells over and over. One could prepare according to their specific needs, so it was a really easy power to use. She'd stabbed to the back of his skull and left him a lightning souvenir. He's definitely dead. But
I'm not done yet! Flow acceleration!
Clementine accelerated, whipped out another stiletto, and stabbed that through his helmet slit as well. On top of that, she unleashed the fireball spell it contained. She hallucinated Momon's flesh burning up from the inside out, and had the feeling she could smell the meat grilling. Instead, her eyes widened in shock at how wrong she was. Yggdrasil didn't have magic weapons like that. The more you know. As he spoke at leisure, with a stiletto still sticking out of each eye, she realized that it hadn't been a coincidence that there wasn't blood on the blade when she'd stabbed him earlier.
No way! This can't be happening! Why won't you die?
She'd never heard of a martial art that made the user invincible. Was there something protecting him from stabbing? Even then, how did he block the magic follow-up? Even the veteran warrior Clementine didn't know the answer. She was pulled in close. Their bodies bumped together, and her adventurer plates jangled. You want to know if you got the answer right? The raven-black armor, poof, disappeared, revealing Momon's horrifying face. It was a skull with neither flesh nor skin. Stilettos were stabbed into both of his vacant orbits, through his mirrored shades, but he didn't give any indication he was experiencing any pain. That appearance rang a bell for Clementine.
An undead? An elder lich?
Well, I sure have some questions for you, but let's just say you're close. And then...
She shouldn't have been able to read an expression from a face with no skin or flesh, but she had the feeling he was wearing a wide grin.
So, how does it feel fighting a caster with a sword? How does it feel to not have it end with a swoop and a shunk?
Don't make fun of me!
Clementine struggled violently to get away, but it was as if she were bound to him by sturdy chains, and she couldn't. An elder lich was certainly a mighty undead, good at using magic and so on, but it shouldn't have much in the way of physical ability. In comparison with Clementine, she should have come out on top, but...
Why? I can't get away!
Her entire body went cold when it dawned on her that his incredible power and physical ability wasn't due to some magical effect in his armor. The image that ran through her mind was a butterfly caught in a spider's web, a helpless creature.
This was the true nature of your handicap. Basically, you weren't an enemy I had to take seriously enough to use magic on.
You piece of shit!
Well, now that the cat's out of the bag, let's begin, after I get these out of my way.
There was a dragging noise as the elder lich pulled a stiletto out of his head and threw it away. Clementine was still struggling as he removed the other, but it seemed even one of his hands far exceeded the strength of her entire body, and she couldn't budge in his embrace. Once the stilettos were gone, the sinister red flames in his empty eye sockets turned to Clementine, who was breathing irregularly as she strained against him.
Okay, let's begin.
Begin what?
Thought Clementine, as the already intimate distance between her and the elder lich shrank even farther. In her ears was an unpleasant creaking noise. When she realized what he was trying to do, she felt as though she'd been stabbed in the back with an icicle.
You aren't... You can't be... You...
The noise was the shriek of her armor, beginning to dent.
He's trying to crush me against his chest!
The elder lich should have been getting squashed against the armor as well, but he must have changed his body to be more powerful somehow. It was immovable, and made her think of a thick wall. If you were weaker... The elder lich took a dagger out from somewhere. The blade was black, and there were 4 jewels set in the hilt. I considered ending your life with this, but I figured there's not much difference between dying on a sword, getting snapped in half, or being crushed. You're dead, no matter what. Her whole body shuddered. Throughout his commentary, the pressure was gradually increasing. The strange weight on her chest was becoming oppressive. Ping! Ping! Unable to bear it, the plates of the adventurers she'd killed began popping off her armor and falling to the graveyard ground, as if they were finally being interred. First to go were the ones she had most recently acquired. It got harder and harder to breathe.
This is awful!
She hated the arm wrapped around her back. She blamed herself for wearing light armor in order to increase her evasion and be able to attach the adventurer plates. Having learned that swords had no effect on the Elder Lich, she began beating his face with her fists, half crazed. She was hitting so hard she was hurting herself, but she wasn't at leisure to feel the pain. Then she drew her morning star and began frantically pounding with that, but she couldn't do it right and only ended up wounding herself. It was easy to imagine the fate that awaited her. The choking breaths, the weight on her chest, and her breaking armor made it crystal clear what would happen. Don't struggle so much. If the position of my arm slips, it'll end too simply. You took your time killing them, so I want to take my time on you, too. Clementine desperately continued her attacks. She tried pushing off his head with her hand, scratching at him till her nails peeled back, biting him with her front teeth. None of it worked, and the pressure continued increasing. No matter how much she flailed, there was no escaping the jaws that were his arms. She still fought. Even as her breathing grew more difficult, and her field of vision began to shrink, she fought for the chance to survive. La danse macabre. She couldn't even spare the effort to hear that quiet remark. There was a gurgling sound, and Ainz was splashed with vomit and blood. Something dark flashed through the red flames in his vacant orbits. Clementine, who had flailed and tried so desperately to escape, had devolved into something that could only convulse. But Ainz didn't let up. On the contrary, he increased the pressure. Eventually, Ainz felt the crack of a thick bone snapping against his arm. He let go of a body that was no longer even twitching. Clementine's corpse fell to the graveyard ground with a thud, like a bag of garbage. Her face looked ghastly, distorted by pain and fear. Like a deep-sea fish that had been reeled in all at once, her innards were poking out of her mouth. As Ainz took out his bottomless pitcher of water to wash the vomit and filth from his body with its endless stream of fresh water, he spoke quietly to Clementine, who could no longer reply. Oh, I forgot to tell you. I'm extremely self-centered.